Okay, hey everybody. I guess people probably will be trickling in over the next couple minutes here, but I just wanted to be conscious of everyone's time and get started. 1 minute late, I guess. So, hi, I'm David Stoleen. I am the director of customer success at DDEV. So what that means is I handle everything from support to pre-sales. And kind of anything in between and maybe outside of that as well. A little about my Drupal history. I've been kind of a long time contributor to the Drupal project in a couple different ways. Primarily, I've been on the security team, but I was also part of the team that brought Drupal to the White House. So I ran President Obama's whitehouse.gov site. So my kind of wheelhouse is high performance Drupal, doing things with the I's crossed and the T's dotted. I guess that's backwards, but yeah, so here you're gonna learn a little bit about demystifying deployment. But first, a message from the camp organizers around the code of conduct. So just a note, everyone is bound by the code of conduct. Don't harass people. If you do have issues with that kind of thing, here are the points of contact. It's Amy, June, and Mike, so you can reach out to them in several different ways. Pound Florida in the Drupal Slack, email them, or you could probably text them. Then finally, last message from the sponsors, or I say a second to last message. Contribution Day is Saturday. They're hopeful to get a ton of people joining and contributing to Drupal in this kind of weird, virtual world that we're living in these days. And then final there is just there's planned workshops, contribution days, people doing things on the experimental Drupal theme called Olivero, Drupal recipes, which I don't actually know what that is, and Simply Test. So cool. Let's get started. So it's hard to tell. I usually do a show of hands at the beginning of most of my presentations. But I assume everyone here is pretty new to Drupal. If you're not, this might not be a great session to you. This might not even be a great session if you do know things like how to do local development, how to manage things like Git. Probably not the best session for you, but you're welcome to say and chime in here and there where you have problems. So today we're going to show you how to basically take a laptop that your employer may have gave you, or your personal laptop, show you some tools around things to do. They heavily sway in the tools my company produces. So you have DDEV Local and DDEV Live. But I don't think any of the workflows I'm going to discuss here are necessarily apt for always using all of these tools. It's just easy and what I'm familiar the most with. And then finally, we'll sum up with launching a fake site that we just created into production. So let's talk about like how you start a Drupal site these days. Most of the time, you're probably starting in a you're not too worried about anything before Drupal 7. So that means you're usually going to work with Composer as your primary kind of interface for managing and grabbing any kind of modules you might need. So like let's first look at what we're dealing with here. So you have kind of a large section of tools you can be using. So you might have WordPresses, you might have Typo3s, you might have Drupals, you might have a variety of technologies that are powering those things. So your Drupal site might connect to Solar, it might connect to Postgres, you might be doing testing with Selenium. You have a ton of different places you can host all of these things. You've got your Pantheons, your Acquias, your DDEVs, your AWS raw, on-prem. So it's just kind of this confusing landscape. But for the most part, I'd say, some high to mid 90s. Most Drupal development really starts on someone's laptop. So who are kind of the players in Drupal's local development space? DDEV, Lando, Drupal VM, MAMP. You can do all of it with yourself with Docker. You can use Doxil. There's literally dozens of others. And if you're interested, you can go read Jeff Geerling's blog post about kind of the state of local Drupal development. There's a survey. You can go look at it and kind of pick the best tool for you. But kind of let's back up a sec and let's talk about like why you might be interested in doing things locally versus like doing things in the cloud or on some development server somewhere. So the first thing is, what is local development? And primarily this is, you're using code that is living on your computer that is running, the kind of dependencies it needs to fully operate a working site. So today, this is very often in a Docker container. It might not be, but Docker has really revolutionized the local development space, and that's one of the reasons like DDEV local uses Docker primarily. But why is local development important here? This is kind of a tough question, but I feel like there's kind of several answers to it. First is development isolation. I can't tell you the amount of times someone thinks that like a server is not being used by another engineer. Someone is tweaking settings and your site is now not working as a result of that. You just have also a better kind of iteration time when you're working locally. You can see the problem, fix the problem, rinse and repeat, and work through that workflow. And you also have better access to debug configurations. So like you can run xdebug. That might not be appropriate in every context to run in any kind of, obviously not production, but like a staging site, it might not be appropriate there. So it's just an isolated environment where like you and you alone have access to it. So how do we get started with DDEV? As I said, primarily the primary local development tool for Drupal sites I use is DDEV local. It's available kind of in two ways, depending on your operating system, of course. So on Mac and Linux, if you've used Homebrew, you just run those two commands, brew tap DDEV or drud/DDEV, and then brew install DDEV, and that'll get installed. If you run Windows WSL2, it's a little more complicated. Go to this link, follow the instructions there, and then you'll eventually get it installed. But the idea with DDEV local primarily is that it is a cross-platform tool. We don't prescribe that you need to use Linux or Mac only. And we do realize that developers have a ton of different either corporate supplied computers or personal computers, and not everyone is necessarily going to be available to use one or more operating systems. You just kind of use the one you get. Okay, cool. My video did show up. So creating a Drupal site is pretty simple. As I said earlier, you have a bunch of DDEV local commands that you can use with Composer. So if you guys didn't catch that, just running right here, the DDEV Composer create Drupal recommended project. And so what that is doing is basically going out to something called Packagist and checking to see what the latest version of this library recommended project is. This is a project that is run and controlled by the Drupal Association and the kind of Drupal Core release manager. So it's a trusted source. So what this is doing, if I can scrub through the video a little bit more. Come on. Is going and pulling all the dependencies for Drupal and any other dependencies that I might need on the site. So in this case, there's a lot of Symfony stuff, because obviously Drupal, I think this is Drupal 9, is pulling all the latest Symfony dependencies. So another kind of thing in your toolkit that you probably need is Git. So you've got a local development tool, and you can kind of think of Git as the way to disseminate your changes across multiple developers in a way that is safe. So here's just a little blurb from Atlassian about like what Git is and version control and why you should use it. The long story short is these days use Git. There's not really any other major choice. I mean, if your day job uses one thing, obviously use that. Git's great for just because 90% of projects are probably on it in one shape or form. And just a note, if you are very new to Git, there's an anatomy of Git presentation that happened right before this one. So if you want to go back and review that session, if you're not super familiar with Git, that's the place to do that. So the next thing in kind of our project setup here is the adding and committing your Git project for the first time. So in the earlier step, you saw me run a composer create project. In this next step, I've basically done a Git init, which tells Git to set up the file system to basically prepare a Git project on my computer. The next step there, I added the two kind of key files for Drupal, so the composer lock and composer JSON, and then I just made an initial commit. So I just have this default commit, and so it begins for any project. The next step of that, I am pushing to a remote. So I added the remote and I pushed it, and now you can see on the screen there, if I can just scrub back a little bit. Yeah, so you can see in this step here, I've added the remote. So this is my GitHub repository, unn/DrupalCamp Florida. I then add the remote, push to that origin, and then in the next couple of slides, in the next second here, you can see I've got basically a blank repository hosted in GitHub. And then once I've pushed, you can see now that repository has basically been filled with the two files that I've added to the repository. But you don't have to use a GitHub here. There are other kind of providers in this space as well. So you can use GitLab, Bitbucket. There's also dozens of these. You might have a hosted GitLab that you use, but it's primarily GitLab, GitHub. They're all kind of these engineering collaboration tools with some little magic of project management. So you get like lightweight ticketing, lightweight collaboration. The real power is just the ability to kind of have your code exist in a way where it won't conflict with other engineers' code. It might conflict at some point, but Git also gives you ways to kind of resolve that and preserve history and do a lot of things. So if you might have done like SSHing or SFTPing code in the past to a server and like untarring it, Git makes that workflow or enables that workflow later on to do some really cool things with obviously deployment. So what have we done so far? We've got a site set up sorry, we haven't actually gotten a site set up. We've pulled a Drupal code base down. We've initiated the project with Git, and now the project is really about engineering. So if you have questions about that, the session's obviously not for you, but there are some workflow and essential Git command things here I've linked, how to like start Drupal development. There's also a good Lullabot article about workflow in development projects, which I think is pretty crucial if you don't know how to do that. So another quick overview or review here. We've got the development tools set up, what we needed. We've got the site set up in GitHub. Any questions so far? I'm happy to check out the chat. I don't know if there's a Q&A enabled here, but I'm happy to pause for questions if you have anything.
There's been no questions so far.
Thanks, Aaron. I'll give maybe like 30 seconds for typing. All right, and feel free to ask questions in the chat. I'm happy to be interrupted by questions here and there. So next step, we're basically assuming that the development has happened. The site's either ready to launch or ready to kind of leave your computer for dissemination beyond what you want to do or how you want to manage your site. So let's go to the next slide. So the problem space local development is good for is like the quick iteration, the better debugging, but there are some problems in just kind of the local development just generally. And there are a lot of mostly around collaboration, but there is some like reducing the bus factor that happens here too. So just generally, like I want to show my work to someone. That becomes hard these days now that everyone is working from home. You might want to just bounce a question off a senior engineer. You might want to show your work to a project manager. You might have like a sprint demo that you need to show, your ticket that you worked on, but also like just the external factors. You might have a new feature that you pushed out that you need some review. So client stakeholders may want to look at things. You might also want to run user acceptance testing. So it's very similar, client goes and looks at a new feature set. Or functional testing, like does my site appear the same way that it did in a previous iteration, but also just kind of the risk reduction that's associated with the code leaving your computer. People get sick, accidents happen to people's laptops, they get stolen, coffee might get spilled on them. Kind of the other thing that seemingly is endless is that some piece of software updated on my computer and like now my development environment doesn't work and I've lost the whole day to it. It's unfortunate that that's the case. That does sometimes happen, and sometimes, most often, the code does need to go somewhere and live elsewhere. Will says ngrok is a nice tool for local sharing. Yes, it is. DDEV local also does have an interface for sharing your local project with ngrok. The trouble is, it's not necessarily always like super convenient to have like an ngrok thing open all day, or your laptop goes to sleep and then it goes away. But yeah, good point. Thank you, Will. So let's talk about getting a dev site online. There's kind of a couple steps you need to take to do this. So Drupal has the 3 tiers of things you need to move. And in our case, we have the code. The code is in GitHub, so that's mostly moved. But the database and the files are still only local to your computer, and we need to kind of free them. So you need to also pick a place to host your site. So any kind of the major Drupal hosts, you can roll your site your own. You might have access to on-prem or cloud. But you can basically have a development workflow that starts and ends in GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, and then is deployed elsewhere. So let's look at what a site creation step might start like after you've selected a host. So in our case, here is a DDEV live command that's basically going to create a Drupal Camp Florida website from that repository I pushed earlier. So in the preamble here, let me pause this. I've basically created the site. It's a Drupal site. I give it a name called DC Florida. I pass the Git repository that is just the one I happen to be hosting, so github.com/on/Drupal Camp Florida. I pass the doc root, so that in this case is web. I pass the Git revision, in this case that is the main branch. Drupal version, Drupal 9, and then I'm asking the command to also run composer install for us too. So you can see here in this case, the site command is accepted, the site's getting created in the background. And that's really all that there is for a site creation step on DDEV Live. So as I mentioned earlier, we also have to kind of liberate the database and the files as well. So in this case, because the site's running DDEV local on my computer, I just export the database. See using the handy export -db command. I'm passing in a file name. In this case, it's just db.sql.gzip. And then it's basically going and dumping my database, putting it into this file for me. And then the next step is pushing this database up locally to my site. So in this command here, I'm just running a DDEV Live push database, Drupal Camp Florida, which is the site I created earlier, and then passing the file name to it. And then our systems are going out and basically grabbing that database dump and importing it into the remote MySQL instance. So there's a couple different deployment workflows we can get to here. I call it the Yolo workflow, but it's a pretty valid workflow just generally. So the first one is a branch just checked out in an environment. So in our case, you may have, so in the earlier site creation step, I referenced a git rev of main. And so that means that I am following the Yolo branch checked out in an environment kind of strategy here. So what that means is my deployments are basically happening automatically when they merge. So if you were to say, create a pull request inside of GitHub or create a merge request inside of GitLab, and someone were to accept that pull request and merge it, that would, in some time after the webhook gets sent to us, eventually run in that site as production, which is a totally valid method. So you have, that might be great for like a staging environment or a integration environment where you have a lot of engineers merging code ultimately into one branch to see if things like work for one another. What you do miss out on are things like you've done a Drupal module update, and there are some database configuration changes that need to happen. You do miss out on that unless you're, explicitly you've watched that the files have checked out, the site's running the correct version, and then you go in and like manually trigger that stuff. Similarly, for any kind of configuration management you might need to do like import or export of the configuration as well. That won't happen, but it is still a valid workflow for kind of, I think, especially non-production workloads. The other method is kind of the responsible, like your I's are dotted and your T's are crossed kind of methodology. Is you have some kind of intentionality about when a release happens. So for instance, on your computer, you'd use a git command called tagging that basically says this point in time is this name, and that is immutable, so it's never going to change. So you have a pretty solid amount of confidence that like this piece of code is then the piece of code that runs here, versus where you don't quite have that in the branch version, because where the head of the main branch might change when another engineer pushes or does something destructive to the repository. With a tag, you kind of know that it is a thing that you can basically look at and say, this is the thing that is this point of time. It's version 2.4.5, and that's what's running in production. So that kind of ends my slide deck here, but we do have a live demo so that my internet's pretty good. Let's show off some things. So everyone should ultimately see a terminal window and then a browser. So I've got a couple things to just kind of show you. Here's my repo as it exists. It's I mean, this is the barest bones that a Drupal repository can be these days, is just a composer lock and a composer JSON file. You manage everything with Composer. You obviously you might have like a custom theme in your site, but this is just the bare bones. I have this site running locally. It's just a Drupal Camp Florida example. And this is running inside of DDEV Live. It's not all that exciting. It's just a very generic Drupal 9 site with the Olivero custom theme installed to it. So let's see what we want to do. So right now I'm on the main branch of my site and I want to do some work on it. So you can see I've got 3 branches. I have some feature branch. I have some dependency updates. So let's work on my dependency updates. So this workflow would be like, it's Wednesday. The Drupal security team has announced a module update for a module that you use on your site, and you just like want to get that out as quick as possible. So let me check out the dependency updates branch, and then because Composer is really slow, I did this in the background. I'm just going to stash apply, and you can see here that Composer earlier figured out my dependencies. I think it was some minor, I guess it doesn't matter. There was just some minor dependency updates here, but I will then add this composer.block and then commit this. I don't really know what I did here, but update dependency. And then I will get push. Cool. And so now, if I flip back over here, through the magic of GitHub, GitHub sees that I have pushed a branch, and that then I can go and create a pull request for this work that I did. Fill out some details around what changed. You can look at the kind of the files, what you've done, comments, how many people contributed to this thing. In this case, it's just me. It's nothing all that exciting. So here's where the cool bit kind of comes in. Because our system, as I mentioned, is connected to Git and GitHub and understands like how our deployment works. Because it's hosted on DDEV Live, I can basically just go and automatically create a new site in my environment that handles like the cloning of a site, so I can go see what my site looks like in this case. So because it's just a super quick dependency update, there's not really anything visually different, but I can basically go trigger a little slash command inside of GitHub, tell GitHub to basically, hey, to tell the DDEV Live systems, hey, I want this new site created that is a clone of my upstream site. So I have the main DC Florida site, and you can see the -pr2, which is just the pull request to in my URL bar there. And because that takes a second, I've done this earlier in another branch. So if we flip over to the main site, you can see this is my production site. Super silly. It's just a minimal install of Drupal. But I do have this branch that I checked out previously here that created a new site for me based on the upstream site, so I can preview my workflows. So if I were to open this, let's see. You can see that this site resembles more clearly my local site, because my local site actually is running this branch that I'd merged locally. So you can see my changes. I've obviously got the Olivero theme enabled here. I've obviously made some theming changes, and you can kind of see this all through what I've done inside of GitHub here. So for instance, I exported all of my configuration. I also made basically, I think, what did I do? Sorry, and made a couple changes to like Composer JSON to include some other resources in my site as well. So what a deployment now looks like here is, for instance, I've got this main branch, which is deployed into my production site. I've got some feature branch that I am proposing to merge, and I can just go inside of GitHub and merge it. So the deployment workflow in this case, since it is using that that YOLO technique that I described earlier, ultimately goes and merges so GitHub handles the merge. DDEV Live then receives that pull request notification that it has merged, and in the background is now triggering a site rebuild based on this kind of new state of things inside of GitHub. So this will take maybe a few minutes, but you can also see like it's deleted my preview sites, and because of a little bug inside of GitHub, you can see that message twice, but a refresh solves that. And so now this site will have been deleted, obviously 404ing. And so now I go back over here and let me just check on the state of things. Oops, I'm not using the right window. Sorry about that. So sorry, it's a little long. Oh, there you go. So you can see I've got several sites on my host in my account. I've got the DC Florida site. I've also got that PR site that I fired off earlier, and we could now also observe this. But I'm really interested in seeing if this merge is done. So I'll do it DDEV Live, describe site DC Florida, and we'll go look and see what the status is. So cool. This one is a little behind and it's currently building. So that just means we're still in the process of basically deploying the site to you. The workflow in this case has just been that YOLO workflow. It's pulling the site in, it's building the dependencies, and ultimately building and going out and making sure the site is functional and working for you. Other cool things I can show off here while we're waiting for this is our kind of new and improved dashboard, which is ultimately this talk, but made a little simpler for kind of first-time users. So the idea is you start here with our welcome page. We get a site running locally for you, follow you through the steps to get everything running, then doing the project creation step, which we took you through earlier. And you can do that with kind of any of the versions of Drupal you choose to, also typo 3 if you wanted. We also support WordPress as well, worth mentioning. The database import step. And then ultimately the next step is the deployment step. So that's installing DDEV Live, and then configuring and setting up Git, logging in with DDEV Live, and then the site creation step here for the first time. So this basically steps you through each of the projects. You can also then do the site creation step inside of GitHub, figuring out the site creation, cloning a site here as well, and then the publishing of your site. So there's a nice little going live guide here as well. Let's check on that site. It's still building. I guess ultimately it doesn't matter. So the next step of the kind of deployment, assuming I'll assume this will build successfully, and live demos, there's always kind of a hitch in the Git log here. But assuming this builds, the next step would then be because I did a configuration export from Drupal as part of this pull request, my workflow would be watching this, making sure it's deployed. Because this is the YOLO workflow, I have to kind of carefully monitor it to make sure it's working. I need to then basically go run a couple commands on the Drupal side. And if you're familiar with Drupal, you'll love the commands, know them very well, because it's ultimately just the drush CR, which is cache rebuild. In my case, I want to also do a config import. So that's drush CMI. But then I might also, because I don't remember like all the changes I made, and maybe there's been a few days since my pull request has been merged, I don't quite remember. I'll also run an update database to just make sure I don't have any pending database updates as well. And then in all intents and purposes, your site is now deployed. And that's using the Yolo workflow. The other workflow is largely the same. Instead of the auto deployment happening, you would have to basically tell our systems to go configure and deploy a branch on, or excuse me, a tag in the Drupal Camp Florida environment. That's super straightforward. It's just a matter of running a config command to tell it to switch to a different Git revision. In this case, it's a tag. Any questions there? I don't see any questions in the chat.
Is there, with DDev Live, is there a limit to the number of little feature branches you can spin up? And
so there's no limit to the number of branches you can use. So for instance, like maybe you have kind of a traditional DevStage prod site set up. You can throw any number of branches onto any of those 3 sites. The limit inside of DDev Live is on the site level itself. So our packages, for instance, our lowest level of service is called the personal site. And that's like geared towards, I run my blog on this site. It gets like 30 hits a month, which I feel like is mostly my mom. And, like the bar for that site, it doesn't need a DevStage prod. It doesn't need, 10 or more environments. So I only have 1. So I'm limited in kind of the would I like to have a staging environment? Sure. But like there's no risk in me having my personal site go down for 5 minutes ultimately. So it's really about the number of sites that you need to have at any given time. But you can switch branches all you want. There's no limit on the amount of branches you have. Thanks for that question.
yes, thank you.
So I guess the kind of the crux of the demystification here is that deployments these days are not as fragile as they once were. I remember when I first was managing Drupal deployments with a tool called Capistrano, and it was basically 50-50 whether Capistrano managed to deploy successfully to every web server in my pool. It was very much like an all hands deck approach. We got everyone on this hour-long phone call. We had to declare a content freeze to our stakeholders. We had to basically do a lot of management around release windows and approval boards, and kind of get all of our ducks in the row in case there were epic failures of the system in some shape or form. I guess my point here more is that if you have kind of picked the right tools, the deployments are kind of non-issues these days. You might have to do some, the change management board, like depending on how your customers work. But the idea is that deployments can happen all the time. They should happen all the time to facilitate quick iteration. And the idea is ultimately like you don't have the distraction of managing infrastructure. You don't have the distraction of babysitting and hand-holding a deployment task. It's a quick, simple. It's kind of a thing that you get into the habit of doing casually and regularly. So you get back time to focus on your engineering tasks. Is, I guess, ultimately the point of this deck, this talk generally. So to just quickly recap, we've seen how we can take a site from your computer, your laptop, store that code inside of GitHub, and then host that site on DDEV Live. You might not have learned how to create a pull request, but you saw me how to create a pull request, as well as merging that the pull request and trigger a deployment inside of DDEV Live. There are some more advanced techniques that I kind of geared down the presentation to discuss how you could do these in kind of in a more automatic way with like a CI/CD tool. So if you're using something like GitHub, you have great integrations with Travis CI to do things like test your sites. You also have great integrations with the Circle CI, similar tool. It's just a preference of what you're using, but we do have kind of advanced guides around configuring a site deployment and then leveraging kind of the automated tool sets that GitHub or GitLab integrate with very easily. So I'm happy to take any questions you have. If you want to ask me about how my my snow shoveling has gone in the past day, but there's also a ton of resources to talk about here too. All of them are basically on our blog. I'll post my slides up soon after this talk. So if you follow me on Twitter, I'll probably tweet out my slide deck here in a minute. And if you need me, I think I will be inside of the gather.town tool if you want to talk to me personally about something, or also I think Ellie's in the booth as well. You can find me on Twitter. You can find DDEV on Slack inside of hashtag DDEV or hashtag DDEV Live. Thanks for coming. If you have any questions, now's the time. Oh, thanks, Cam. I mentioned both GitHub and GitLab. Do you recommend one over the other? No. A lot of times, the tool choice is up to maybe not necessarily you. It might be, what your company decided to pay for. Maybe one is cheaper than the other. I don't necessarily recall anymore. I think they're both really excellent tools, and the idea is that you do use one of them. There's dozens, maybe even 50 very similar tools to GitHub or GitLab. The answer is it doesn't really matter. Use what you're comfortable with. I know people in the past, and I don't mean to sway anyone's opinion necessarily in one way or the other. In the past, people have kind of gravitated towards GitLab because it is an open source project, whereas GitHub is, a closed source project that is owned by Microsoft. They're both pretty solid tools. The problem more often than not is like one of these services goes offline and their development kind of comes to a halt. But these days, it doesn't make a difference. And I think of it like a developer snow day, I guess. Anything else? Cool. So someone direct messaged me, can I use another local environment or hosting provider with DDEV? Sure. I just illustrated kind of the very simple workflow that I kind of appreciate with the tools I use a ton. So as I mentioned in the earlier slide deck, there are other local development providers, such as Lando, such as Doxel. You could roll it your own with Docker. The idea is DDEV doesn't really care. Obviously, we'd love to host your sites, but you don't have to. So you can use DDEV to like push a site to Pantheon, for instance. If you host with Pantheon, you can use DDEV soon to push the site to Acquia if you host with Acquia. And if you want, we'll also have a facility that like you can host your site wherever you want to with us very easily. Sorry, you can push your site very easily anywhere you want to. So we're in a very in a upcoming release of DDEV local, you'll be able to basically configure some YAML to basically push your site wherever you want it to go. So if you host it with AWS and are using like their code tools, you can do that with DDEV local. It's just as simple as configuring the commands, and then our systems basically understand how to like push to that. Yeah, so you don't have to use necessarily anything I've suggested here to include the local tool or to include the live tool. It's just kind of a matter of, I think ultimately, use the tools that you're comfortable with. But I think the one thing that I will say is make sure you're using Git or a version control system, and that facilitates a lot better ease and better transitions when you are doing releases. Thanks for that question. Anything else? All right, it sounds like that's it. If there is anything else we want to talk about, feel free to reach out to me. I am available pretty much all day for the rest of the day and should be in the virtual conference, whatever it is, gather.town. So thanks everyone for joining me today. Hope you have a good Friday. Enjoy your weekend.